Hi guys, it's looking more and more likely that Boris Johnson will return to run the Conservative Party because he keeps dropping hints about how things were better when he was in charge, and when he was challenged here on GB News about Nigel Farage and reform, well, he claimed that they were on zero support when Boris Johnson was leading the Conservative Party. Have a listen.
How did the Conservatives tackle the threat of reform? Because 5 months ago, Boris, you spoke to Patrick Christie's, my colleague.
Yes, great. Yes.
You said to Patrick, of course the Conservatives will recover. And Patrick said, you don't see a Prime Minister Farage then, and you said absolutely not. That was 5 months ago. Since then, reform have been topping every single poll going by some significant margin. Have you changed your mind on that?
Look, let's see what happens. I still think that my party, the Conservative Party, will recover. And I tell you, I've said
how can they tackle reform?
Because we're offering serious, sensible policies on home ownership, on the economy, things that people really care about.
You don't think reform's policies are serious?
I can't think of one, to be honest. Except they don't want to reform welfare. That's the only thing I can think of. They don't want to scrap the cap on benefits for families with more than 2 children.
They do want to scrap that, yeah.
No, they do want to scrap it.
Yeah. Mass deportations.
And I think it's completely mad. You know, why should working people be paying more and more in their taxes for families that choose to have more and more kids?
Can I ask you then why they're topping the polls? Why do you think they're topping the polls? Why are the public being allured to
I don't know. You
must know.
You'd have to.
Come on, you're former Prime Minister. You must
remind you. Let me remind you of the answers I normally give. Well, when I was Prime Minister, can you remember what they were in the polls?
Reform.
Can you remember? I'm going to tax your
probably very low, but I'd argue
they were between 0 and 3%.
Farage wasn't leader.
They were hovering between 0 and 3%.
I'm not here to defend reform, but I don't think Farage was leader at the time. It was Richard Tice, maybe. Farage came a bit later.
What I'm saying is they're on 0%, okay, right. And which is where they should be and where they will be again.
Okay.
So reform will go back to 0% if Boris Johnson comes back. Look, so there's a few things to say about this. First of all, when it comes to polling, just to give you an idea of how off the polls can be in respect to reality, back in 2020, there was a poll done when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, just after Get Brexit Done, and it had predicted back in 2020 that if there was an election held that time, the Conservatives would win a massive majority, increase the majority that they had, and Labour would sort of disappear. So, polling so far out from an election is pretty useless. It just takes a snapshot in regards to the feeling at the moment, but it's not a predictor for the future. So Boris Johnson is somewhat right here. Look, you can look at polling. It's not going to be a good predictor for the future, and maybe Reform are doing really well in the polls. But remember, when I was Prime Minister, Reform were at between 0 and 3. And it's true that Nigel Farage was not on board. It was a new party in a sense. It was the remnants of the Brexit Party. The Brexit Party, of course, stood aside to help Boris Johnson in 2020 or in 2019. So the new party, which was restarted in a sense, the Brexit Party restarted with Richard Tice, not doing very well. And we saw that while it did somewhat increase its support in the run-up to the election last year, when Nigel Farage jumped on board, of course, it gave it booster rockets. But I have to come back to this point about Boris Johnson. Either he's playing with the public, or he's hoping that Kemi Badenoch crashes and burns, and then he's welcomed back in as some sort of hero. Look, Boris Johnson is very good at campaigning. Boris Johnson is very good at grabbing attention. And I think if he did really jump on board this, if he was really serious, that he could do some serious damage to Labour and Reform in particular, because remember, a lot of people left the Conservative Party for Reform because they believed that it had abandoned its principles. And a lot of people who are not happy with how Boris Johnson was treated within the Conservative Party have abandoned it as well, and they've gone to Reform. A perfect example of that is Nadine Dorries, a huge Boris Johnson sycophant, and has said in the past that if Boris Johnson led the Conservatives again, she would return. And I think this is, while she's a bit of an outlier, this could be applied to a lot of people who are currently supporting Reform UK. They're not happy with Labour. They're not happy with the current Conservative Party. And if Boris Johnson did come back, as I keep saying, many people have short memories, he could win some support for the Conservatives. The Conservatives' position now is only up. Okay, so if Boris Johnson did come on board, I think it would boost the party. Now, would he become Prime Minister again? I highly doubt it. Would the Conservatives form a majority? Highly unlikely. But he would, in a sense, boost the Conservative Party, because at the moment they're facing extinction because of reform. So I think Farage and Reform are really concerned about a return of Boris Johnson, and this is why they've been pushing this Boris wave in regards to immigration, trying to blame all of the immigration problems on him, and the post-Brexit rise in foreigners coming in from outside the EU. So they've been trying to lay all the responsibility for this at Boris Johnson's door. But if he does come back, I think there will be a sort of nostalgia within the Conservative Party and a sort of amnesia within the public regarding Boris Johnson, which would help him. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. I'll see you in the next video.